Logian 31 is one we're familiar with from the New Testament. It's no prophet is accepted in his own village, and no resident physician practices healing upon those who know him. It's a little different than what we're used to. This clarifies the issue of Yeshua's self-consciousness, by the way. This is definitely an authentic davar. He calls himself a prophet, and that's how he thought of himself. He didn't call himself Christ, Son of Man, Messiah, God, or anything like that. The word physician in Greek is iatros, but in this case it's pro-atherapues, which is the Coptic Marasoin. Thomas adds a Semitic parallelism, no resident physician practices upon those who know him, and it's not in the New Testament, but it is Aramaic, it's Semitic, and it's a parallelism. Physicians were often unsuccessful in treating their own friends and family, and instead brought in another physician to treat them. People still do this today. It's not part of the Hippocratic Oath, but doctors won't normally operate on their own family and so on. And that was known. It was a proverb people knew from those days. So what is he talking about with no prophet is accepted in his own village? Do you know what he's talking about?
Well, it's your family, you're just you. They aren't going to listen to you the same. I mean,
No, he's talking about a time when he was rejected in his own hometown of Nazareth.
Well, yeah, because he was just Yeshua.
But what he's talking about historically is the rejection that happened to him. And he's talking obviously then to his Talmidim about, don't go to your own hometowns, because this could happen to you too, this, just for the reasons you said. The word that was translated into the Greek of the Septuagint for therapuein was from the root yasha, meaning one who resided or was in resident healing service. The original Aramaic phrase would create the parallelism that we know is favored by Yeshua, if that is what underlies the Greek words of Thomas, and we think it is. So when we translate it from Aramaic, a clear parallelism becomes evident. No prophet is accepted in his own village. No resident physician practices upon those who know him. And it's an Aramaic thing. It's very authentic, and we know it from other sources. So probably he used this saying when he sent his disciples into the villages of Judea and the Galilee to preach the Basor. He reminded them to learn from his own bad experience at Nazareth. None of them should try to preach the Basor to his own family and villages. Rather, they should go to villages where they were not known. If rejected in strange villages, he gave them another thing he told them to do, which is to shake the dust off your sandals as a testimony against them. And that's discussed more thoroughly in the book, what that means. But a resident physician, Yeshua was called a physician, and he did the work of a physician, but he didn't sit in one place and have patients brought to him. He was more of a miraculous healer. But so this, there are two proverbs that he strings together here, and this is probably what he means by them. He's telling the people when they go out, don't try to go and talk to your own family and friends. Send some of the other guys out to do that, something like that. And that's a good thing for us all to remember, as we all know. Now, he gave instructions for this sacred journey that these people would make in pairs. 2 by 2, they went out to all the villages. And they're recorded in Mark and repeated with some elaboration in Matthew and Luke, and they're based on purity laws for entering the temple. Theirs was a sacred journey as for a temple pilgrimage. They traveled in pairs. Yeshua sent them out. He said, these were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. So you're going out, pretty bits, you're not really prepared for anything. But you take a staff. Do you know why they took a staff? That was the only means of self-defense they had. Wear sandals, but not an extra tunic. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. In other words, don't go door to door. That's, people, let it be known that you're there, and people come and see you. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave as a testimony against them. And then they went out and preached that people should submit to the Malkuth. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. So that's what we have from Mark, and it's a little different in the other Gospels. If we read the Palestinian tractate, it was taught a man must not go up the hill of the temple, neither with shoes, nor with dust on his feet, nor with money wrapped in a cloth, nor with a girdle on, nor may a man make use of it as a shortcut, unless still may he spit there. These are directions for not profaning the temple, and the directions that are given, these very strange directions about taking no bread, no bag, no money in your belts, and all this sort of thing, are very much like the directions that were given for people when they were made a pilgrimage to a temple. In the Babylonian Gemara, it says, as it has been taught, a man should not enter the Temple Mount either with his staff in his hand, or his shoe on his foot, or his money tied up to his cloth, or with his money bag slung over his shoulder. They should not make it a shortcut, and spitting there is forbidden. So these instructions that Yeshua gave were somewhat influenced by Talmudic instructions about purity with regard to approaching the temple. So I call this a sacred Basor journey, the journey that these disciples made in pairs, according to Mark, to different cities to proclaim the Basor, was seen as a sacred journey. Now, removing sandals and washing the feet was one way of keeping profane energy out of a sacred place. Another was dusting off the sandals. So when Yeshua's messianic preachers resumed their sacred journey through Israel to proclaim the Basor after having been rejected in a village, they reconsecrated themselves by shaking off the dust of the village streets. That is not an act that cursed the people of the village, but purified the disciple from the klipot and the elilim that came through, that had been directed against them from the negative forces. And that influence was considered to be transmitted through contagion. So the dust of a place where evil forces rule must be removed for purification. So that was the meaning of his directions. Sandals are the only thing that protects your feet from the stones and the rock and everything else, but they also can pick up some bad vibes. Cooties. Don't want to bring it to a sacred place. I'm considering Logia 32 and 33 together, Logia 32 and 33. A city built on a high mountain and fortified cannot fall, nor can it be hidden, and proclaim from the housetops what you will hear in your ear. For no one lights a lamp, puts it under bushel, nor does he put it in a hiding place, but rather he sets it on a lampstand, so that everyone who enters and leaves can see by its light. This is from the only place we find this material, aside from Thomas, is in Matthew. Now, Matthew's gospel was made by using Mark as a source, and then using the Q source, which he and Luke both used at some portion. That's lost, except for how it's preserved in those gospels. And he had another source we call M, the M source. This is these are all the things in Matthew that are strictly from Matthew. Nobody else has them. I'm just listing them right here. We call that the M source. And this seems to come from that same source as the M source. But it doesn't seem to be copied from Matthew. So it may be that Matthew's source, some of that M source, which we find a lot of in Thomas, because Thomas is mostly made up of what we call the Q source material. And then the next biggest bunch of stuff it has is original material of its own that we've not seen anywhere. And then it has about 12 or 14 logia from the M source, but not from Matthew's gospel. So that may mean that the source that Matthew used, some of the same source that Thomas used for his gospel. So, and the interesting thing also is that these appear in exactly the same order as in M, but it's not because it's copied from Matthew. There is the special M material in Thomas. I'm listing for you right below here. There's a whole lot of different sayings in Thomas that are from Matthew, or the Matthew source, but they're not said with the same words or in the same way as Matthew. So this idea of proclaim from your housetops, this was an idiom meaning the public proclamation of the Basor. Basor was done publicly. It's not something that was done privately. Even though he told his disciples to go to somebody's house and have people come to him, it was anybody who wanted to come. The Basor was a prophetic public proclamation. And then it says, what you hear in your ear and in the other ear, literally. It's an Aramaic idiom. In the Greek, it says what you hear in your one ear. In the Coptic, it says what you hear in your ear and in the other ear. And what it means is what you hear in private. That's an Aramaic idiom for that. The M source says what you hear whispered privately in your ear, proclaim on the housetops. But all of this means is the knowledge that you're gaining from me Kabbalistically is part of this proclamation you will make. It will not always be hidden. It will be revealed. He doesn't say to cast your pearls to the swine. He doesn't say to give the dogs holy food. Don't give your holy food to the dogs. But he does say that all of this knowledge, all the Ratzim, all of the mysteries are to be known. So the M source adds a Semitic parallelism as a preface. This is what I tell you in the dark, tell in the light. Now, in Thomas, we have a probably earlier, more authentic version of this when he says what you hear in your ear and in the other ear. But Mark and all the synoptics take what Matthew has said here, what he's added to it, and they do it as a separate devar. They say, no one lights a lamp, puts it under a bushel, but on a lampstand, and those in the house see the light. But Matthew connects this to what I tell you in the dark, tell in the light, and that's probably that for that reason. So what you will hear in your ear and in the other ear, or privately, being a Semitic idiom for private Kabbalistic instruction, indicates that we have an independent source for this saying. And again, as I say, it doesn't mean they were to teach publicly everything they learned of the Kabbalistic teachings, but it was for those who had ears to hear and those who would understand. Sometimes we have stories of Yeshua taking someone who is just a hearer, who comes to hear him, and he says, come follow me, be my disciple. Or he takes him out even and initiates him. Just somebody that's not even been one of his followers. And that is a cause for jealousy. He tells a parable about workers in a field. Some of them work all day long and some of them are hired at the very end, but they all get the same pay. And that's because Yeshua had a way of recognizing people's spiritual readiness. And there were people that came to them a lot later in the game who were much more ready than some of his apostles and disciples were. And so they were taken in very quickly and given fast advancement and initiated, whereas others might take much longer time. So those who had ears to hear were those who were ready to hear and understand, and there were people out there who did have ears to hear. The city built on a hill. Well, the ancient cities were always built on a tell, or a hill, on the flat plains of Palestine, so you could put up a watchtower to detect invading forces, and they were manned all the time. But it wasn't always a successful defense, and the walls were broken down. They were broken down from the outside in. They were broken in. That's why the story of the Jericho's walls falling from the inside to the out is considered to be a miraculous event in the Old Testament. But normally when they're invaded, the walls are pushed in and then people come in and invade. And they leave the city a pile of rubble. And then the city was rebuilt and strengthened on that same pile of rubble, using a lot of the same stuff to rebuild the city. And that eventually built a hill called a tell. So scientists can identify the conquering and defeated civilizations by the artifacts that you find in various strata of the archaeological dig. Now, there were no mountains upon which to build cities. There were not real mountains in Palestine. A few of them were pretty tall hills. But in addition to these man-made tells, there were also hills overlooking plains that were used as building locations. The cities were all walled with tall watchtowers, and the water was not often available, so cisterns had to be dug to collect rainwater, and sometimes that was collected and put underground so it wouldn't evaporate, and you could walk down deep into this thing to get the water. And there were also roads that led to nearby springs. Now, walled cities built on hilltops were visible from a long distance across the plain. And a large, wealthy city attracted a lot of caravan trade, and travelers were able to see the city from great distances of 2 or 3 days away. And so a city built on a hill cannot be hidden. And the connection with the lamp on the lampstand is that large caravan cities remained lamplit. That was how they were lit up, by oil, lamplit at night so that caravans and travelers could find them and get there. And then they would set up camp at the gates and wait for the morning to be let in. And the city lamps could be seen at night flickering on the hilltop. And so the hilltop cities were like lamps set on a lampstand. So that's kind of the background of this. And we can dig down through these things and date the civilizations and from each stratum and so on. And this is still going. It's an ongoing project in Israel. If a blind man leads a blind man, they will both fall into a pit. That was a very common aphorism, a proverb at Yeshua's time. It's one that Yeshua quoted in reference to a certain application. The blind were the Pharisaic synagogue and Sanhedrin temple leaders who opposed John the Baptist and the Basor and Yeshua. And in Yeshua's view, their blindness was rooted in a lack of light in the heart. They weren't putting out light. See, your blindness is because you're not emitting light. They had brought this on themselves by choosing to be stiff-necked and refusing to recognize the validity of contemporary messianic prophecy. They said, oh, well, the prophets were great in the past. We honor them. We whitewashed their tombs and all that kind of stuff. But there's no more prophets, and the ones that say they are today are a bunch of phonies. So they rejected the preaching of John the Baptist, and they refused to submit and keep faith with the Basor. They had hardened their hearts, blocking out the perception of new prophetic works of spirit with what was known in that day as the evil eye. The evil eye was the eye that looked out without any interior light, but just saw simple material things, or the projection of darkness in their hearts. So, in any case, the Yetzer Hara, the evil Yetzer, dominated the divine light of the hearts and their eyes, and so the perception became blind. Now, there were a lot of blind beggars on the streets of cities and villages, and they sat down near the marketplace every day begging for alms, and then the relatives who were sighted would lead them back to their places, but sometimes another blind beggar would lead one blind beggar, and they would not get where they needed to get sometimes, and they'd fall into a ditch or something. And so the folly of one blind person leading another and then falling into a ditch was a proverbial thing. And what he is saying basically is that the leadership, the religious leadership in Jerusalem associated with the temple is blind, is spiritually blind, and people who follow that, and this leadership, the Pharisaic leadership, was trying to extend its influence into all the synagogues of the Galilee to the north and in Judea, everywhere else. They hadn't been totally successful in doing that, but that was what they were trying to do, kind of control it, set it up that way. And Yeshua was very opposed to that. He doesn't like centralization. He liked decentralization, I guess. So he said that if you follow your blind leaders, you're not going to get where you need to get. "35 says it's not possible for anyone to enter the house of a strong man and take it by force unless he binds his hands, and then he will ransack his house. This is an independent version of a Markan saying we find in all three of the synoptics. It's about the invasion by evil spirits, which were known as Elilim, little gods, similar to what we find in 21b about the thieves breaking in. To bind his hands is the Greek expression meaning to bind the hands, and it's but in Aramaic it becomes to make captive or to put into prison. So the hands metaphor is for your powers and your abilities to operate and freedom to act, and so he's talking about bondage, which is the opposite of freedom and liberation. So if anyone binds the hands of the strong man, he will be able to come in and take over his house. The interpretation is twofold. It may be an isolated devar, in which case it's about the means by which a demon binds and possesses a human. And the means is, the strong man is you, the master of your soul, the master of your sovereign home, your nephesh, your personality. In addition to the vulnerability of the heart to corruption by choosing the wrong impulses, there is also vulnerability to possession by Elilim. And Yeshua dealt with demon possession. These were entities controlled by the Klipot, who lived in a kind of meta world between flesh and spirit. And so it's the means by which one becomes possessed, going from obsession to possession. Now, the nephesh is a personality. It survives after death, but it eventually dies and decays. It's your personality. Your personality is not immortal. Your sex, your personality, and so on. The soul, what was called the soul, the higher principles are the neshama, the ruach, which connects it, and the neshama, and the yahid, which is the highest form of that. All that was what is called very often with one word in the New Testament, a soul. That's what Yeshua means when he talks about losing your soul, your higher principles. Now the nephesh, your personality, is subject to invasion and corruption through the heart. But that's not the immortal soul. That would be the neshama. And that was defiled or purified by the mitzvot of the nephesh. In other words, what you do in your life and flesh is what can stain your soul, or it can purify your soul. The nephesh is the incarnate personality, and survived death for about 6 weeks, and then in a healthy death it would dissolve back like your body does into the elements. But the neshama would withdraw through ruach, through spirit, and ascend to the third heaven for purification, perhaps in a purgatorial situation, or for sleep and reincarnation. And the nephesh of the tzaddikim, of the saints, had purified the immortal neshama already on earth, so their souls would experience continuity of consciousness after the dissolution of the human personality, and they would enter the Kima and live as awakened beings in the Pardes of the third heaven. So this is a devar about the only way that you can get taken over by negative forces is for the hands to be bound. And the binding of the hands is talking about the means by which the evil forces enter. That means you no longer are able to resist your negative impulses. Your hands are bound, your powers are bound. The second possible case for this, in the context of the pericope, the story setting that's given in all three synoptics, this is given in a story about the means by which Yeshua bound and exorcised a demon. And so it's connected with this story in all the other things about the Pharisees who accuse him of casting out demons by a pact with Beelzebub, or Beelzebul, as it was known. That's the Talmudic Aramaic Zebul, the Baal or Lord of Dung. It's called the Lord of the Flies by some people, because flies fly around dung, but he's the Lord of the pile of shit, Lord of Dung. So Yeshua argues, how can Shaitan cast out Shaitan? And in this pericope, Thomas Logian would refer then not to the means of possession, but to Yeshua's method of freeing the possessed person from a demon. The method would be magical and Solomonic by binding the demon's hands. The way exorcism was done by Jewish exorcists was to bind the demon. And Jews were noted exorcists, and he would demand to know the demon's name. And once you have the demon's name, you have control over the demon. It's very much like a 6th grade classroom. You know the names of all the kids, you got control of the classroom. If you don't know the names of any of the kids, you're dead meat. And the first thing a teacher learns when he goes to teaching. So you get the demon's name through the demon-possessed person, through his mouth. If you are a powerful being like Yeshua, the demon can't resist. He ought to tell you his name. If you're not strong enough, he won't tell you his name. But if you tell him his name, that knowledge allows you to bind him and command him to depart from the human host. This kind of exorcism was successful if the person doing it was a great saint or a prophet of God. Lesser saints like the disciples, who were given authority to exercise by Yeshua, might find themselves lacking in power against certain kinds of demons. So, I told you, as any public school teacher knows, you got to know the names of the demons and the names of the kids. If you have the names of the demons, you are able to control them. That's why the naming Solomonic magic was knowing and learning the names of the demons. But the evidence of Thomas Logan 35 transmitted independent of this context in Mark suggests that originally it stood as a simple isolated devar. And so my explanation for case 1 would probably be correct. It probably was interpreted this way in the New Testament because people were familiar with Jewish exorcism and the binding of demons by getting their names and so on. So we don't know exactly what it is, but what we do know is that probably if case 1 is correct, then what Yeshua is saying is that the only way you can become vulnerable to the negative forces is if your hands are bound, if you bind your hands, if you don't take your own action, if you don't stop yourself from doing what you're going to do, sort of thing. I think that's probably right. Here we have some Greek. In Coptic Thomas, Jesus said, "Do not be concerned from morning until evening and from evening until morning about what you will wear." This, in the Greek Oxyrhynchus papyrus, becomes, "Do not worry from dawn to dusk and dusk to dawn about what food you will eat or what clothing you will wear. You are much better than the lilies, which neither card nor spin. And for your part, what will you wear when you have no clothing? Who would add to your stature? It is he who will give you your clothing." Now, obviously, this is not dependent upon the Greek version we have at Oxyrhynchus, and the Greek Oxyrhynchus knows the versions we find in the New Testament of the Sermon on the Mount. It's in Matthew's special material. This, by the way, this idiom, "do not be concerned from morning till evening and evening till morning," don't fret and worry. From dawn to dusk and dusk to dawn is not found in the parallel New Testament source, so it is evidence of Aramaisms and independent transmission. What you will put on or wear, it's used in the next Logian in reference to the physical body that is taken off like clothing at death, and which is taken off in mystic experience as well, and probably provides some mnemonic connection between the two. So 37 and 36 were probably transmitted from memorized themes about non-attachment and about non-attachment to your physical body at death, because they're grouped together in both the Greek source and the Coptic translation. And they seem to be an extension of the shortest of the Logia, again, "Become ye passers-by." It has to do with non-attachment. So what does it say? Well, Greek Thomas adds the question, "What will you wear when you have no clothing?" So the authentic part of the Devar, probably the first 2 lines only. The Q version in Matthew and Luke presents more elaborate sermons. Matthew 6 tells you the whole sermon about, "Look at the birds of the air, they neither grow nor sow nor reap, and you are better than the lilies, and see how he clothes the lilies of the valleys," and so on. Very beautiful. And so don't worry about what you will eat or drink and all this sort of thing. It's not the first time we see material in Thomas that may have been translated from an earlier and less elaborate Greek version than the extant Oxyrhynchus recension we have now. And since that dates about 200, it may be that Coptic Thomas might have been translated from an earlier 2nd century Greek recension in the 100s, like 130 or something. It hadn't been expanded as much. We don't know. The quotations from Thomas that are found in various church fathers, because we find them there, are unfortunately 3rd to 5th century. They don't give us a look back at 2nd century Proto-Greek Thomas, but they do demonstrate significant variations from the extant Greek and Coptic version. So it indicates that Thomas, like Luke, was a work in progress over a couple centuries, that things were added to it. And the thread that links this to the other Logian is the theme of clothing. In Thomas, clothing is a metaphor for fleshly incarnation. It's not a literal concern about mundane clothing. But Matthew and Luke present it as though, as it was about a concern about actual food and clothing. So it's interpreted about this, but the redactor of Thomas, being a monk, interpreted as food and clothing meaning your body and your things that you're going to leave behind. And the Thomasians were ascetics. They weren't concerned with those mundane things. So since Luke and Matthew each presented the full lilies of the valley sermons, we can assume that Logian 36 is probably originally part of a longer sermon, resolving the anxieties of mundane life that Yeshua talked about. And so the redactor of Thomas left out the parts, probably. And this was probably not just something that was remembered in the original dictation, which it's not clear, but it's very different than what we have from other early versions. But this leads us to a very important topic. That's the Gnostic and the Capitalistic robe of glory. Now, remember in the Greek it says, "Who would add to your stature? It is he who will give you your clothing." That's in the Greek Thomas. When Yeshua said, "If God so clothed the grass," meaning the lilies of the valley, "how much more will he clothe you?" he referred to the Kabbalistic robe of righteousness, which is multifaceted, multicolored, and Joseph's coat of many colors was an allegory of this coat of many colors one would wear in the Shema. It first appeared in the Babylonian Trito Isaiah. In Messianic interpretation, this was the raiment worn by the Zaddikim. Paul's spiritual body represents an early Christian adaptation of the spiritual body. Is entirely different than the physical body, the sarkic body, just as a plant is different from the seed. In Isaiah it says, "I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, my soul shall be joyful in my God, for he hath clothed me with the garments of salvation, he hath covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decketh himself with a garland, and as a bride adorneth herself with the jewels." And this was Kabbalistically interpreted, that after death the righteous would receive a robe of glory, like a king's robe. So these were Gnostic antecedents, or Kabbalistic antecedents to the Gnostic robe, the Gnostic multifaceted royal robe of the purified soul that returns to his eonic home in heaven after laying aside his flesh. And the hymn of the pearl, which we find in the Acts of Thomas, describes the perfected soul's return to heaven after successfully completing its mission to recover the pearl, which is the original divine identity that's been lost in the bondage of fleshly incarnation. It's very beautiful. I'm going to give you a little translation from the old Syriac text in the Hymn of the Robe of Glory. You can find this online. And this is the soul after he's been to Egypt in earth. He's been to the evil place where all the bad people are, and he's accomplished his job. He's found his gnosis. He's found who he is. Now he's dying and returning to heaven. The glorious robe, all bespangled with sparkling splendor of colors, with gold and also with beryls, chalcedonies, iris-hued opals, with sards of various colors to match its grandeur. Moreover, it had been completed with adamantine jewels. All of its seams were oft fastened. Moreover, the King of Kings image was depicted entirely all over it. In other words, the Zelum, the image of God, was depicted on this robe. As with sapphires above, it was wrought in a motley of color, I saw that moreover all over it the motions of gnosis abounding. I saw it further was making ready as though for to speak. I heard the sound of its music, which it whispered as it descended. He's going to heaven, and the robe is descending to him. And he says, "Behold him, the active in deeds, for whom I was reared with my father. I too have felt in myself how that with his works waxed my stature." This is the adding to your stature. "And now with its kingly motions was it pouring itself out towards me, and made haste in the hands of its givers that I might take and receive it. And me too my love urged forward to run and to meet it, to take it. And I stretched myself forth to receive it. With its beauty of color I decked me. And my mantle of sparkling colors I wrapped entirely all o'er me. I clothed me therewith and ascended to the gate of greeting and homage. I bowed my head and did homage to the glory of him who had sent it, whose commands I now had accomplished, and who had too done what he'd promised." That's the covenant. I do my part, you do your part. "And there at the gate of his house sons I mingled myself with his princes." You get to mingle with all the other Zadokim. "For he had received me with gladness, and I was with him in his kingdom." And it is kingdom, basileon. It's not just sovereignty. It's not a son of man thing. So that it was a development of the Kabbalistic idea of the royal robe of righteousness that one is clothed in after one loses one's flesh. And that became the Gnostic robe in the Hymn of the Pearl. We have one more Logian here that's related. This is the one where his disciples asked, "When will you be revealed," meaning in a vision, "to us? And when will we see you?" And Jesus said, "When you take off your garments without being ashamed, and take up your garments and place them under your feet like little children and tread on them, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and you will not be afraid." Now, I put this in different colors for different reasons. Here in the Greek it says, his disciples ask him, "When will you be revealed in a vision to us, and when will we be able to see you?" And we know it's in a vision because the Greek word means the same thing. He answered, "When you make yourselves naked without being ashamed." Now, the red of this translation of the Coptic on this side of the page does not appear in the Greek. It has all the earmarks of a possible later Gnostic expansion. The Son of the Living One is a Gnostic title for the Heavenly Redeemer, a distortion of the original Bar Enosh taught by Yeshua. And the purple part presupposes not a post-resurrection manifestation, but later revelatory visions that the Gnostics base their ideas upon, because the Gnostic literature is all based on now 100 years after Jesus has died, he comes back and consults with you and gives you visions and tells you stories and so on. Now, that goes very much against the Johannine thing of where I'm going you can't come, you will see me no more. But the Gnostics very much did a lot of channeling and had visions and wrote their stuff based on that. So the purple part, his disciples ask, "When will you be revealed to us," meaning in a vision, and when will we see you? In other words, what do we have to do to get a vision of you? That's definitely Gnostic. That's not anything early at all. It's there's two things in the visions of Jesus. There's the resurrection appearances. The resurrection appearances go on for a set time. They correspond very much with Buddhist and other mystic ideas of the nirvana, what do you call it? Of a dharma body, and of the idea that great saints can appear, or that before one is ascended, so to speak, before one has left the nephesh body, that great saints can be seen and they can actually be touched and so on after they die. But then after a certain period of time, that body disappears and they ascend. And that's what all the resurrection appearances of Yeshua seem to be about. That's the way they're all described. But then the appearances after he's gone, like Paul's vision of Yeshua, of Jesus, And then the Gnostic Redeemer seen by the Gnostics is a whole different thing that Jesus never talks about. It's not in his teachings, and but it becomes a big deal later on. So that's what this seems to be about. And you will not be afraid contradicts the authentic Logia number 2. When he finds, he shall be terrified. The divine fear experienced when coming face to face with Godhead. So this is pretty much another Gnostic Logian. The disciples asked, when will the Bar Enosh be revealed to us, and when shall we see him? And Jesus answered, when you disrobe without being ashamed, and take up your garments and place them under your feet like little children, and tread on them, then you will see the Son of the living, when you will not be afraid. Now, this part is probably not a Gnostic addition. So it's probably not about when will we see you, but when we see the Son of Man, when will we see him? And that would be in a Merkaba ascent or after death. So the question about when the Messiah and the Malkuth would be manifest on earth is a big issue with the disciples and everybody. And Yeshua once answered it in this way to his greater circle of disciples when he gave them power over dark forces. He said, you will not have gone through all Israel before the Malkuth manifests on earth. That was, by the way, the reason that Schweitzer said that Jesus thought the world was going to end before he died. That saying was the basis of this academic assumption that Jesus was what they call an apocalypticist, and so on. But the answer in Logian 37 is given to his inner circles. They will be able to see Messiah and God's sovereignty manifest on earth when they learn non-attachment to the illusions of the physical body and world, and to see it with the eye of the soul rather than the eyes of flesh, when they are no longer seeing as they would be flesh beings. And that can be compared to Logian 113, the Malkuth of the Father is spread out upon the earth, but men do not see it. How do we see it then? This is how you see it. You've got to get out of your body. And that's what taking up your garments and place them under your feet like little children and so on. Not necessarily meaning dying, and this can mean going into some kind of an ecstatic experience. And Logian 80, whoever has known the world has found only the body, but whoever has known the world as an external body, of him the world is not worthy. This is a Gnostic saying, or would have been the way the Gnostics would understand it. The world is not worthy is a Gnostic idea. But it's the way the Gnostics understood this is that if you go into certain kinds of trances, you can have visions of God and Jesus, and you won't be afraid. Very different. So physical death, you know that motifs of clothing and garments and disrobing are used in other Davarim as Kabbalistic metaphors for the flesh and leaving the flesh behind, and the nephesh, which is the outer personality. To disrobe is to die consciously, which is a practice that was taught in Rosicrucian and other medieval mystic traditions, still taught today in Tibetan Buddhism and other traditions, and probably was taught by Yeshua, how you die consciously. Yeshua was on the cross a very short time. He died very quickly because he wanted to die. He made himself die. And that's what he taught his people to do. It was something that was taught mystically to people. Now this occurred in two stages. The first is physical death, in which the ruach, or spirit, withdrew from the flesh and the human body died, according to Kabbalistic teaching. The second occurred about 6 weeks later, when the ruach withdrew from the nephesh, or invisible personality, that survived death, the astral body or sidereal body, as people, Rosicrucians, would have said in the medieval period. Yeshua's resurrection appearances for 40 days after his execution was in his purified nephesh body that could appear, transmit speech, disappear, walk through walls, and all this kind of stuff. With normal human beings, the roughly 40-day period after death is when those close to the deceased might hear their voices or catch glimpses of them out of the corner of their eyes. Mediums have their best luck in contacting the dead. The astral shell or nephesh of the deceased seems to dissolve, and the pall seems to lift after a normal mourning period, except in certain cases that can produce ghost and possession phenomena. As a saint of the Kima, however, Yeshua was able to move and operate consciously in his nephesh body, which he could apparently manipulate at will until a time came for his fully conscious second death, or ascension as it was called in Christianity. So in my understanding of Kabbalistic interpretation, this Devar seems to reveal the following. When the disciples are able to die consciously without fear, without being ashamed, and when they are able to retain telepathic communication in service to those who are living in flesh, which is to tread on your garments and place them under your feet, and the feet represent your understanding, then they will be able to see the Son of the Living One face to face, and they will be able to stand in that presence, that is, to not be afraid. So how much of this is Gnostic, how much is Kabbalistic, I don't know. This is all speculation on my part. But those are Kabbalistic teachings. They're also Gnostic teachings. So, in the Thomasian Gnostic idea of physical death, this gave rise to the idea of the docetic, or the seeming appearance that Yeshua had always been a spirit. In other words, they couldn't crucify him, they couldn't put him in pain, they couldn't kill him. He never left footprints. It was not he, but another who suffered crucifixion, and many stories like this. Cerinthus was a proto-Gnostic opponent of the Johannites about the year 100 of the Christian era, who taught that Jesus was a normally conceived man who received the Christ Spirit in his baptism by John, and like the Ebionites, who were the Jewish Christians, who were totally poor monks, said that the Christ Spirit left him at the crucifixion, this human Jesus. And that's, so they say, my power, instead of Eloi, Eloi, my God, they say, my power, why hast thou forsaken me? And the resurrected Jesus was actually the Christ Spirit that was animating Jesus, a bodiless spirit, and probably exactly what is refuted in John's Gospel against the Thomasians. His idea that the world was created by a lower demiurge, that was Cerinthus, was later developed in Alexandria by Valentinus. We got the whole Valentinian Gnosis. And this was much opposed by the Johannites, but accepted by Thomasians. So the Syrian Thomasians promoted Cerinthian and docetic ideas, and their Gnostic view of Jesus as a docetic revealer is always a red flag. They want to separate stuff. For the Thomasians, the resurrected Jesus was an immortal spirit, the Cerinthian Christ Spirit. He needed no ascension, as in the New Testament text, and advanced Gnostics could communicate with him in visions and receive revelations. But Johannine tradition disagreed with the Thomasians and the Cerinthians and the other docetics of Asia Minor, and emphasized not only the reality of Yeshua as an incarnate flesh and blood human being who suffered and died, but of his bodily nature even as the resurrected Christ. And there's a representation of Thomas sticking his fingers into the wound in order to believe, and so on. Read that in just a minute. And so Paul took on much, Paul and John, the Johannine and Pauline views of things are very much the same. In John's Gospel and in Paul's view, the Last Supper happens at the time of the slaughter of the lambs, which makes no sense because they couldn't have crucified him on the Sabbath. In the Synoptics, it takes place on a different night. It would have actually been the night before. I'm not sure whether I'm getting this backwards or not, but the idea of Jesus as the Lamb of God and as a sacrificial thing is something that is taken up in Paul and held up by Johannine stuff. And Paul emphasizes very strongly the flesh and blood reality of Jesus. So he has opponents in Corinth who are saying this kind of stuff, that Jesus was a spirit, he was a mortal spirit, and all this sort of thing. And so Paul gets very adamant about emphasizing the flesh and blood reality of Jesus, that he really died and he really this. And so that was a big issue in those days. The anti-Thomasian doubting Thomas story is actually anti-Cerinthian. That's who they were really opposed to. It wasn't Thomas the Apostle. For the Thomasians, physical death for those who had gnosis was merely escaping from the bondage of the mortal coil of flesh and becoming free. The spirit would return to its heavenly home, and so on. Ignatius of Antioch, who I told you a little bit about earlier, carried on the Johannine opposition to docetic Christology, and he was martyred at the turn of the beginning of the 2nd century. And that docetic issue was put to rest in all the churches that would eventually become proto-Orthodox Christian churches and became purely a Gnostic idea after that. And that is one of the things we find here in Thomas's Gospel, where Jesus is always portrayed as, the spirit that comes from heaven, and he's a God everywhere he is. It's not a real human. He's not suffering. There's nothing about being crucified and all this sort of thing. We're still talking about Logia 38, and part of it is many times you've desired to hear these devarim that I am revealing to you, and you have no one else to hear them from. This is followed by 38b. There will be days when you will look for me and not find me. That's what we find in John's Gospel. This is, of course, a prediction of his death and all this sort of thing. This implies that Yeshua, 38a, this first part of this Logian, regarded himself not only as a prophet but a revealer, because he's giving devarim. His words were divine devarim from God. Logian 38b is inauthentic. It's the redactor's conscience reference to the Johannine saying that in future days Yeshua would be absent from them, from their sight, and so on. And this implies, as I said before, they would not be able to contact him through visions. So his instruction about how will we see the Messiah, the Son of Man, and so on, would imply that kind of vision, the seeing of the Messiah, would be a different person than just Yeshua. It would be a different thing. It would be a different divine entity, and so on. In Johannine tradition, the absence of Jesus was filled by what was called the parakletos, the paraclete. It's in Hebrew, it's a legal counsel or advocate, and it's a form of the Ruach HaKodesh we know from centuries earlier literature. It's another name for the Holy Spirit, but it's masculine. The Holy Spirit starts out as feminine, Ruach HaKodesh, feminine. It becomes in the New Testament neutral. It becomes hagios, pneuma hagios, which is a neuter term, and then it becomes, in Latin, it becomes spiritus sanctus, a masculine term. So it kind of loses its femininity through that. And here the word parakletos is also a feminine word, but it is a word that is actually used of the feminine Ruach HaKodesh as many as 100 years earlier in some of the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. So this whole issue of of gender wasn't really such a big deal. And I've given here a little history of the recorded claims to a vision of the risen Christ after the resurrection period. That starts with Paul, and then after that there come the church, and the church was going through what we call pneumatic experience of having visions and so on. Those who sort of channeled or brought through the guidance of the Parakletos, either in tongues or through dreams and visions, were delivered their message. In fact, a lot of the guidance the early church got was from psychic type of guidance like that. It was very important, and women were better at it than men. And that was, for example, Paul tells us that he was told by someone who channeled the Holy Spirit not to go this direction, but to go the other direction, and things like that. So we know that it was being used in that kind of way before it became revelations with Gnostics and so on. This term, parakletos, appears in earlier intertestamental literature like the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. In Jewish Haggadah, the divine Ruach, the Spirit of God, played the role of defending attorney in the court of God versus Shaitan, who is the prosecuting attorney. A rabbinic term found in 2nd century Talmudic literature is the Hebrew paraklita, friend of the accused. And that, by the way, is a term that's used in one of the parables of Yeshua. In the parable of the unjust steward, the good deeds of the accused act as paraklita, or defending attorney, or advocate, in the judgment that happens right after death. And Yeshua talks about two judgments immediately after death, and then he talks about an ultimate judgment of the Son of Man upon the new Adam, upon the old Adam, and so on. And that would determine the length and type of purification required in the purgatory before one could go into the paradise. And interestingly, I've mentioned this before, but normally in Talmudic literature, the period that was assumed for stay in purgatory to be purified before one could go was a few days to a week. Although in the most extreme cases in later Talmudic, it was considered to be a possibility of a whole year, but certainly not eternal damnation.